Hey, today I want to talk to you about some basic techniques for watercolor. If you didn't watch my previous video about the tools you need for watercolor, please watch that. It's super important. We are using all the tools I talked about in that video. The first thing we want to do is wake up our paints, and nothing fancy here. I just want to show you guys how to use the basic techniques with watercolor. So we want to get some water in here. A lot of times I get asked the question, how thick should your paint be? And that really just depends on the saturation of the color that you want. So the more water you add to this, the lighter it's gonna get. The less water you add, the thicker it's gonna get. The only thing I do want to mention is you never want your watercolor paint to be like acrylic paint. So fresh out of the tube, super thick, almost like the consistency of like whipped cream or something. You don't want it like that. My brother actually paints with watercolor paint like that, and it drives me crazy because he'll use an entire tube of paint for one painting. So that's not watercolor. Watercolor, you add a lot of water to. Okay, so let's start with wet on dry technique. So it's just as it sounds. It's a very simple, I'm gonna show you wet on wet technique and wet on dry. Wet on dry is just what it sounds like, dry paper with wet paint. I'm gonna grab my paint and just paint a little square. This is not the prettiest color. Okay, so wet on dry is really great if you need to make very detailed work, line work. I use wet on dry a lot for when I'm doing venue illustrations or I want a more realistic looking painting. Now we're moving on to wet on wet, and wet on wet is wet paper and wet paint. So remember, just make a little note here. This is wet on dry. So the paint is wet, but your paper is dry. And then for wet on wet, I'm gonna grab water and I'm gonna make a little square. This is great for washes. Now that the paper is wet here, I'm going to get my paint and just poke around. And your paint is only gonna go where the wet is or where the water is. So it's really cool. You can get more of a wash. Like I said, this is really good for if you're doing washes. Just poke some in here. You can get some cool paint bleeds in it. So this is wet on wet. Wet paint, wet paper. Super basic. These are two basic techniques that you can use with watercolor. Another way that this kind of translates is if you want one color to bleed into another. So you can do this with wet on dry, but it works really good with wet on wet. I'll just make two circles. So you have one here and one here. Just gonna add the color in. It bleeds into itself. Not very interesting because I didn't use opposing colors, but you can do this with wet on dry too. So I'm gonna grab this very bright red and I'm gonna make a circle. Make sure you have adequate amount of water or it won't blend into the other side. I'm gonna rinse it off. I'm gonna grab blue and I'm gonna make a circle. I'm not gonna touch them yet. I need a tad bit more water. And then when they touch, boop, they start to bleed into one another. This is a technique that people like to use when they do loose style watercolor paintings where everything's kind of bleeding into itself. The wet on dry is what you're gonna see when you're doing more detailed work that you want straight lines and you need to be able to see. It's a different style of painting, but you can do both. I do both. All right, let's talk about saturation. Saturation means that your color can be really deeply saturated or it can be really light. So I'll use this red here and I'll start off with the red. I'm just pulling it straight out of my palette and it's going to be really, really saturated. I mean, this is almost too saturated. Do you see how when I paint, you're seeing this dry edge a little bit? That's a good sign that you don't, or a bad sign, I guess, that you don't have enough water on your brush. So you don't really want that when you're watercolor painting, so we would want to add a little more water. But again, we want this super saturated. Now, I want to lighten this color by adding more water. So I'm gonna dip my brush and I'm gonna just go like this. See, it's lighter. And then again, dip my brush. I'm gonna get an even lighter tone. And you could even add a little more water. I encourage you to practice this. It's practice in the variation of the hue. Watercolor, you know, typically you don't use white. And since you're not using white, you need to find a way to lighten your watercolor. We will have a whole video on mixing colors and getting the colors that you want, but right now I'm just using straight colors. I'm not mixing them with another color. Again, this is the most saturation. I'm gonna dip, rinse off some of the pigment, not all of it, and then come back. It's lighter. And this paper is really high quality, so what's happening is you do have to use a little more water, whereas if you were using a paper that's not high quality, you would notice that the water wasn't really soaking into the paper. But this is nice because you get to use a lot of water, which you should, it's watercolor. Again, I'm gonna rinse and then do that really, really, really light color variation. Lastly, I don't really have a name for this technique, but I just want to show you something that I do, or two ways to paint a leaf. And you could paint anything like this. I'm just saying a leaf because that's what I'm going to paint right now. So grabbing this color. Okay, so I have my paint and I'm going to do an outline. We're just using a leaf type of shape. So I do the outline, and instead of painting it in with what I have right now, I'm gonna go to my water, I'm gonna rinse, rinse, rinse until there's no pigment on here, but I do have water. And since this is still wet, I'm just gonna touch it, and you're gonna start to see it kind of bleed in. Okay. Another technique is not drawing an outline and filling it in, making more of just a shape with your brush. So I'm applying really light pressure, then I'm pressing down and lifting. And I'm gonna need a spot more water. And then coming over here, light, press down and lifting. So these are two of the similar, same kind of shape, but this one I outlined and then put water in the middle so it could kind of blend. And this one, I just used my brush to make the shape and press down to get it to kind of fan out. One thing I want to mention is you might notice that you have too much water on your brush, and that can be an issue a lot. So I always keep a paper towel, or today I have a microfiber cloth, and you just blot out the extra water. It's a great way to make sure that you don't have these huge blobs of water, and it's a technique that has saved me a lot. Another technique that you can do is lifting off the color, and I'll show you how to do that. If I make a circle, but I want to kind of produce a highlight over here. So let's say the light is coming in this direction. I'm going to rinse off my brush completely, Then I'm going to blot it so it's pretty dry. And then I'm going to lift the pigment and the paint off with my brush. Pretty cool, huh? So this is a way where you can add a highlight or take off some paint if you put too much pigment down. It's a great way to show light sources, and I use this technique all the time. So I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial on watercolor techniques, and this is a good foundation for you to get started with watercolor painting.